The history of this ranch and these buildings is just fascinating, and that's why it's on the National Register. John Churches and his whole family lived here. They came here and started construction. They built the house first and the barn, and then I'm not sure on the timing of the rest of the structures that are on this site.
Mary Ann and John Churches, they lived and farmed or ranched the property from 1862 until about 1910 when his health declined. She, we know, was also very active in the women's suffrage movement, which is kind of a nice aside, I think, when you think about women in the West as settlers. They had a large role in what was happening. Mary Ann Churches passed away in 1889. She was 72 at that time, and John Churches lived until 1910. He was 87. After his death, Georgiana Baldwin and Cain Baldwin, who was his daughter, they took over the ranch, and they managed the ranch for a number of years until about 1918. And then they sold the ranch, and it was subsequently sold to Denver Water by 1937. So that system was about 480 acres, and a portion of that is Long Lake Ranch in Arvada currently.
We went to Jefferson County Open Space, and they purchased it in 3 acquisitions, and I think it was 1989. So Jefferson County had bought the land for the city of Arvada, and I thought, well, what's that junky ranch thing on the southeast corner of that site? And it wasn't junky. I mean, it was junky, but it had historic significance. And at that time, the Arvada Historical Society was doing some research on this site and all the numerous buildings that were here. So we started the planning on Long Lake, and the Historic Society came to me and said, hey, this ranch is of real significance. First, we did the master plan on Churches Ranch, and we finished that in 2002. It was on the National Historic Register at that time, this ranch, about 50 acres. So we were able to go to the State Historical Fund to get some funds to start the renovation on some of these buildings. The priorities were the house and the barn.
A big part of our role was to understand all those parts. And it did expand over the 480 acres. We didn't assess all of those, but we did look into how those influenced the 48.9 acres that we have at the ranch currently. It was a location along a well-trod route that would be used by travelers, where the family would take folks in, feed them a meal, have water for the stock. Being a ranch, they had the facilities to take care of livestock, which would have been an important component of being a traveling spot. In 1862, when land was being subdivided and the U.S. government was enticing settlers to come out west, they created the Homestead Act. And under the Homestead Act, you could lay claim to a piece of property. You would go to the patent office and put in your patent application. In order to get a patent application, you have to have some development on the property. And at the time, Mr. Churches built a stone house, 20 by 40 feet, with 4 doors and 6 windows. Also a stone barn and corral, 2 wells of water, and a log barn and corral. He built an immense reservoir irrigation system with ditches and canals that would be usable for a ranch, to have livestock, to sell livestock, to grow crops, to feed that livestock.
John C., he was very innovative and how he masterminded the water coming off of Ralston Creek. He, according to the records, he had the #1 water rights on Ralston Creek.
It was over 400 acres that he farmed. So, a pretty progressive person and a pretty successful farmer.
Very enterprising man. He butchered cattle and sold the meat in Arvada and Golden, and was involved in the Grange Hall. I look at him as he was a very enterprising man. Coincidentally, that's the name of the Grange Hall in Arvada.
He was definitely a leader in his time, there's no doubt about it. And if you look at some of the articles and whatnot about the history, he was very highly thought of and looked up to. John was known as Rawhide Churches, so he was probably a pretty tough guy. Hard to imagine what it looked like way back then. Now you got all these houses out here on the mountain and stuff, but what a neat place to settle.
Under the master planning process, we were the architectural component of that, trying to kind of peel back the layers of history here. And then we also served to design the rehabilitation of both the barn, the silo, and the ranch house. The condition of the barn was really sad. The roof was partially there, partially gone. The doors were kind of falling off. You'd go inside and yes, it was being used, but it was really not a safe condition. It was kind of a miracle that it was still standing.
The construction of the barn was basically a random rubble stone wall system on all four sides. The barn's about 35 by 50 feet. And then the floor structure and the roof structure are heavy timber posts and beams that were hand hewn, and much of them were pegged together at the time, which was somewhat typical of the construction in the 1860s. Those stones were mortared together with a lime-based mortar, which is not typical of modern construction, but it was typical of the 19th century construction. There were two big issues with the structural stability of the barn. The first one was that the roof structure itself had been spreading over the years. As it settles, it's pushing the walls outward. What happened in this barn is the walls stayed stable because they were so thick and so strong, made out of masonry. But as the roof came down, it actually started to push the supports off the tops of the walls. And so the main thing we were doing was to be able to slowly pull those sill beams in to get them back so they were sitting on top of the wall. They couldn't move more than 1 inch in a 24-hour period. So it took them several days to pull things back into relatively straight alignment. In the gray steel tube at the very right-hand portion of the picture is some of the bracing that we put in to keep the walls from spreading further. One other thing that was a significant problem with the barn was the upper floor, the floor above our head right now, was really intended for storing hay in. If you look at some of the floor joists or the floor decking above, you'll see there's a tremendous amount of sag between members. So to bolster the second floor, we actually built a new structural floor on top of what you see down here that is designed to carry current day loads. But part of the whole historic restoration process is you're trying not to interfere with the visual impact of the existing building. You want people to be able to see and appreciate what's really been here. So it's intentionally hidden. And the other thing that was really a problem with the building was that the bottoms of all of the interior wood columns were severely rotted. They'd just been set in stone and then in the dirt, and over the years they'd rotted away. So this new post, just a Doug fir timber post, has been set on a new short stub of steel tube column that will keep the wood away from any rotting tendency and provides a structural support. This sits on top of a concrete pier that goes down about 3 feet onto something called the Bigfoot footing.
There are not that many stone-type barn structures that are left. So that's really unique. And we looked at those little turret things in the barn, and there's so many kind of romantic things that we all try to envision that may have happened here. Were those for gun placements, or I don't know, because they're shaped like this, so that, and small openings. So who knows what those were used for. There's some rocks in the barn. There's one that looks like a whale. Was that done on purpose?
I think it's just impressive that you see what people did in those days with what they had to work with and how well it's lasted. I mean, think about the fact, basically this building is 150 years old and still functioning today pretty much the way it functioned back in the 1860s.
This ranch house is a pretty amazing ranch house. It's not what you typically see in ranch houses around the state. Most ranch houses are frame construction, wood construction, but this ranch house has very thick masonry walls. So imagine taking field stones, everything from river cobble to just stones lying out in the fields, and consolidating them into a wall with some loosely cemented sand and water. That's pretty much what these walls are all about.
We had to do a special type of plaster to renovate and resurface the walls, which we did. But then we got to the foundation. The foundation was stacked rocks, which was not very stable. So we had to try to figure out how to stabilize those rocks. We couldn't take them out, of course, because they supported the building. So what we did is put some reinforcing bar in and then forced concrete in around those rocks. But we didn't know we were going to have to do that until we dug down.
The history meant a lot more to me as I became older, and then my children, you know, they were interested.
I know everybody in the family thinks a lot about the fact that this place is here. And it is very neat that it's on the Registry of Historic Places and will always be here.
I know that the citizens of Arvada, especially those that we worked with on the master plan, that was their goal from the outset, was to make sure that this place would survive into the future. The most remarkable piece about the way the city of Arvada has gone about the management of this property is in a very authentic way, in that they've looked to a tenant that would have the same goals, but that would also provide that ranch feeling. So it is less of a scene, and it's really more of a historic place.
The downstairs of the ranch house is eventually going to be interpretive displays about this area and the history. And then the Horse Protection League, who are tenants here, who are wonderful tenants, and we'd love to stay here because they do wonderful things for abused and neglected equines.
This is kind of an eddy in pure residential development. And when we talk about being able to capture our roots, to have that connection to our roots, it's places like Church's Ranch that provide those authentic stories, those authentic experiences that really make us understand what it is to be a Coloradan.